Well, we'll begin with prayer, and specifically since Friday is the feast of St. John Chrysostom in the Byzantine churches, so we will pray his troparion, which is specifically his liturgical hymn. And there are two hymns. There are more than that because he has a few feasts, but we'll pray the one that is his traditional one first, and then the second one after the Glory to the Father. The second one was actually composed when his relics were returned from the Vatican in 2004. So it's a recent composition, and we'll get into some of that too as a part of this evening's conversation. So, in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. The grace that from your mouth shone forth like a torch illumined the universe. Treasures from the absence of avarice it deposited in the world. It showed us the height that is attained by humility. Now you instruct us by your words, Father John Chrysostom. Intercede with Christ God, the Word himself, entreating that our souls be saved. Glory to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, now and ever and forever. Amen. The Church once more rejoices splendidly on the occasion of the arrival of your holy relic to the city that you worthily shepherded, and she glorifies the heavenly giver, O Father John Chrysostom, and she cries to you, behold your throne, O Holy One. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. I guess I'll begin with a little bit of background. So we do have, talking about background, we have St. John Chrysostom right here behind me in the icon screen of our church. I think the reflection is a little too strong, but he's there. And so one of the things I guess this is, it's very important for parish to celebrate its feast day and to know its saint, to know it's whatever the church is dedicated to. And so that's one of the reasons why at least once a year we can take a look at St. John and how he has impacted our parochial life, and also what he teaches us and continues to teach us. And so that's the main reason why I chose him for this evening's little conference webinar. And one of the things, St. John has also, the parish has had an interesting history with him. Just over 40 years ago, when this parish was founded and dedicated to St. John Chrysostom, so the pastor, the founding pastor, was able to obtain a little fragment of bone from the Vatican to have here in the parish. At one time, it was attached to that icon, although it really wasn't. I think the way it was attached was rather dangerous. It was not put on very nicely. So when we began some of the renovations here on the icon, so that was patched up and his relic was put into an icon. And beautiful hand-painted icon of him that had this reliquary attached right under his neck, attached to the icon, and it was, of course, venerated in the church, and it was in the sanctuary when we weren't celebrating his feast, so it was in the sanctuary on the bishop's throne that is behind the altar, so an appropriate place for the icon with the relic. Well, about 6 years ago, our church was broken into, and the icon with the relic was stolen, as were a number of lamps, the parish founding chalice, A lot of things were taken. And but the church, thankfully, no graffiti, nothing that was done. The tabernacle was untouched, even though it was sitting right there with the key not quite hidden. Who's going to hide the key to the tabernacle, right? And somehow that was all protected. There was, so you kind of think, well, it's a shame to lose, especially these items that are so special to the founding of our parish, such as his relic and of course the parish chalice. And so after initially the police, searched around, nothing was found. It was never, nothing was ever recovered from what was taken. And so I wrote a letter to the Patriarch of in Constantinople, which is today Istanbul, since the relics in 2004 had been moved from the Vatican to the Patriarchal Cathedral in Constantinople. And so I wrote a letter to him, personal letter, and I explained the situation. And he invited me over to come visit. And so I went and visited with him. And of course, what was kind of expected, he said that they have nonstop been getting requests from churches for relics and shavings and dust from the bones. I mean, anything possible from parishes all around the world. And so he said that he would love to give me a piece, but that it's just not possible because ultimately the Patriarchate would end up with nothing because there are so many requests. And so it was understandable. He gave me a commemorative booklet, as well as a number of other books about the return of the relics to Constantinople. This was made commemorative booklet for all the people who were there in November of 2004. And it gives the history, and of course it has that hymn that it was for the return of his relics. And so it had, I had a very nice visit, have my commemorative selfies and pictures and all that. And it was very interesting because, of course, the main thing was that I was able to pray at the actual relics of St. John Chrysostom. And so I did get a chance to pray for my parish, my parishioners, and of course, for the persons who have taken the relics from us. And when I returned back, I got a phone call from the Byzantine priest in Dallas, whose parish was founded 5 years after us here in Houston, and by the same priest, the same founding priest. He was here, and then he went to Dallas. And he contacted me, and he told me, in going through what they have as far as different relics and things. So he said, it appears that Father Bob, the founder, got us a relic of St. John Chrysostom too, except the parish is of St. Basil the Great. So he said, we'd like to give it to your parish. And so we got the relic back, and the lady who painted the icon painted now the same icon in a bigger form with the relic right here. And so it's this, we basically, God provided. It did not lose anything, and I got a bigger icon too. So St. John does have a certain history here with the parish, even in recent times. But this is one of the fathers that I think everybody has heard of, and many have read, quotable things from him. Very seldom do we actually read an entire sermon of his or some of his commentaries because they're very dense. They're theologically written in a way that is quite concise, doctrinal, and beautifully worded. But I think it intimidates a lot of us when we open it up. Now, for those of us who are Byzantine, both Catholic and Orthodox, so of course he is best known for the homily that is read. It is a part of the homily that we read every year on Easter Sunday. It is read in between the ending of Matins and the beginning of the liturgy. And it is a beautiful masterpiece of early Christian writing and poetry, and the way that it is composed is really has it as probably like the hymn of Easter. It is probably the most prolific, and if you'd like it, so just look it up, Easter Homily, St. John Chrysostom. It is available everywhere online. It's not too long because it's excerpted, but it is beautifully, beautifully expressed. And but St. John is an interesting person. So let's focus in a little bit on his life story, because I think that is what is most interesting about him, and something that we may be a little even surprised. So he was born around the year 346, 347. And he was from a well-to-do family, reasonably well-to-do. His father was a military commander, and his mother, Anthusa, was a very devout Christian. His father unfortunately passed away. We don't know exactly how, if it was in battle or from other causes, but he passed away shortly after John's birth. And, so John did not have really the presence of a father in his life. His mother, who above all, she valued education. So she decided that despite having lost certain financial means because of the death of her husband, she was not going to seek remarriage and was going to focus all her energies on the education of her son. And so she took him to the finest schools, and very specifically, he studied in what is today the city of Beirut, in a Greek-style university, which meant that he would have studied various disciplines and then chosen what we would call a major. And although he would still have to study all the other disciplines, including fine arts, literature, rhetoric, logic, philosophy, medical sciences, science, astronomy, all these things were a part of a classical Greek education. And when I say Greek, so I mean specifically pagan Greek. The majority of the instructors, the teachers at this school in Beirut were, you could say, notoriously pagan, because at this time the Roman Empire was in the process of very aggressive Christianization, and many people were being baptized every year. And so, this was one of the last places where many of the pagan philosophies were still okay to be taught and to be presented to the public without fear of some retribution, because it was a place of learning. John himself, he excelled in all of his studies. Specifically, he excelled in rhetoric and logic. And there was a hope that he might perhaps turn to a career in politics or maybe even law. However, John displayed a preference for the Christian virtues, so the Christian philosophy, as well as early Christian texts. And so he began already at an early age, he would have been a teenager, to turn away from the things that were pagan. Now, John also was growing up in a time when it was rather uncommon for children to be baptized. And so it was common amongst especially the middle classes for children to be baptized at some point, usually before they were 20 years old. And so John was baptized when he was 18. And by this point, he had already made a conscientious decision that he was not going to pursue any more of the pagan studies, including philosophy, and rather he was going to focus on Christianity. And so he was baptized in the year 367, when he was about approximately 18 years old. When he turned 21, he was tonsured as a reader. As a teenager, he came under the influence of the Archbishop of Antioch, Saint Meletius. And Saint Meletius became for John a father figure, an authentic father figure, and especially for his growth in the Christian faith. And so Meletius, who had guided John and answered his questions and had the opportunity to influence him by witnessing to his own faith, Meletius rather abruptly, in the year 372, was sent into exile by the Byzantine Emperor Valens. And this was in the city of Antioch, so not Constantinople. The first 30 years of John's life take place essentially in the far eastern corner of the Mediterranean. So where we have today Lebanon, and then Syria and Turkey, right in that little corner, that is the area where John was born and raised and lived and was educated and served also in the church. And John's desire, though, seemingly had grown through his education, had grown for monasticism. And so with that fire, that passion for the monastic life, he goes off into one of the Syriac monasteries outside of Antioch. And there he has a life-altering experience, and quite literally life-altering. He becomes very concerned about his own passions and the control of any inclinations or tendencies, the control, of course, self-control in the face of sin. And so for 1 year, John dedicates his life to the traditional monastic life within a community, And the community has quite an austere lifestyle. There are common works, there are shared responsibilities within the monastery. Every day, the monks have one common meal together, which consists of bread, salt, and water. This basic, rigid diet affected John physically. But John continued with it and actually amped it up. He went, after 1 year, he was given permission to go live in a cave as a hermit. And the hermits, you know, they really lived an austere life that was beyond the capabilities of most regular monks. And he chose, as one of his practices, he chose the control of his sleep. And so in his cave, he had hanging from the ceiling 2 ropes that he would be able to lean on and in his struggle to not sleep. And so he would take kind of, I guess he would, when he felt drowsy, he would let himself hold on to these ropes. And so he would sleep standing. And I guess we could call like some sort of a monastic power nap. But this did not do him much good. This affected his health even more. And the extreme cold of the cave also caused him many health problems. So much so that he had to give it up. It was just not an option for him. And he was summoned back to the city of Antioch. And there he was ordained in the year 381 a deacon by Archbishop Meletios, who had been reinstated and was returned from exile. And so he serves a period of 5 years as a deacon in the Church of Antioch. And Antioch is one of those patriarchal churches. We spoke a couple of months ago about the structure of the church as being, in that period, a pentarchy, which included the Church of Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Alexandria, and Jerusalem. Each one of the archbishops of these sees was called patriarch and ruled over a large territory. For example, the patriarch of Alexandria was entrusted with the entirety of Africa. And the patriarch of Antioch was of Antioch and all the East. And so they had a lot of responsibility. So he served at the patriarchal church in Antioch, and he became very well known for his writing and his preaching. And this was as a deacon. And so during this period, he wrote a number of writings that are still extant and used for spiritual reading and even theology. He wrote 6 discourses on the priesthood. Then he wrote a couple of books that had to do with monasticism, including Against the Opponents of Those Attracted to the Monastic Life, and then The Comparison of Imperial Power, Wealth, and Eminence. And both of these works are dedicated, they're a defense of the monastic life. One of the issues, and it's interesting because things seem to be repeated. And so, you see the criticism of monasticism was that this was a form of spiritual life that took people away from their families, took them outside of society, took them away from parishes, and then they lived isolated, and they produced nothing. They depended on donations of people, and they claimed to be praying, and so the people were criticizing them. They were saying that, monasticism isn't really useful. How does this function as a spiritual life when it doesn't necessarily contribute anything for real to the church? And it's an interesting thing, because after Vatican II, that was one of the things that many religious orders went through, where if they had more of a contemplative life, they looked into becoming more apostolic. And that's where you end up with the terminology of, religious life versus monastic life. And so even, this is in our day, this is something that's still talked about. And so John Chrysostom addressed it with these writings in defense of monasticism, especially since he had just had this profound monastic experience. And he didn't come out of it scarred. He didn't come out of it with PTSD. If anything, he wanted it more. And so even though he couldn't take much more of the fasting, even though he suffered because of the freezing temperatures in the caves, even though sleep deprivation was not good for him, he still desired more monasticism. And so it wasn't a bad experience for him, even though we would look at it, as something quite destructive, at least for his life. And so he writes these works, but he also begins to write other very important works that establish him and his style of exegesis, which then he uses in his homilies. So one of the things that the fathers play around with was, how to teach the people in the church the basics of Bible study, Bible reading, Bible literacy. And so that was something that was very near and close to his heart. And so he began writing and preaching, because his writings are very often his homilies, and vice versa. And so he begins this style of hermeneutics, which is called exegesis. And so it is the explanation of the biblical text. He was not as influenced by things like allegory. Allegory is the comparison, looking at something and then seeing a reflection of something else. And so it's a different way of reading scriptures. He has that, but it's not as in the other fathers, specifically St. Gregory the theologian, who employed that technique in his writing and preaching. So John Chrysostom begins with commentaries and homilies on Genesis, the Psalter, the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of John, and then the epistles of St. Paul. Then he has a couple of thematic things that come up, specifically apologetic homilies. So these are homilies that defend the faith. And these, there are two groups that are his main focus, or at least are the best known. And those groups, which he's looking at how they're influencing the people in the parish. So this is not some tirade that is going on gratuitously, but rather he sees that these two groups are influencing his people. And so he addresses these issues. And one of these groups are the pagans, who are still a big presence within the city of Antioch itself and that part of the Mediterranean. And then the other group are the Judaizers. And there's a little unfortunate thing there that in his writings against the Judaizers, it has actually come down translated in Latin and then in subsequent other languages as against the Jews. And so very often it is brought up as, some sort of anti-Semitic literature, which it is not, because he is addressing a tendency within his community of something that was still very much alive. So just to understand who the Judaizers are, this is a problem in the early church from the very beginning. Remember that Jesus reveals himself within the context of the Jewish faith and culture. He is the fulfillment of the Messiah. And in order to understand who Jesus is, we have to understand the Old Testament. We have to study and pray the Old Testament. And so that reality amongst the apostles meant that there was an attitude already present among the apostles. And number one among them was Peter. And this preference was that converts to Christianity would first convert to Judaism. And so it meant that in order to be fully Christian, one has to accept the law of Moses and the Jewish traditions. Now, to what extent, we don't know. But the problem came about that other converts to Judaism, specifically Pharisee converts, so they had a certain niche within Jewish society, and their understanding of Mosaic law, the law of Moses, and the Old Testament prophets, and the law in general, the customs and traditions of Israel, they were the ones who faithfully and very passionately preserved these traditions. And so for them, this seemed to be the natural thing. After all, they understood Jesus as the Messiah, as being the next generation of Judaism. So they didn't see Christianity as being separate from Judaism, but rather the continuation of Judaism. So we hear about the Council of Jerusalem, where the apostles gathered together with Paul. And this is specifically in Acts of the Apostles, chapter 15. And there they decide that after rather lengthy debate, that Christians or converts to Christianity from paganism did not necessarily have to become Jewish first. And Paul was the one who really did talk about it at length. And for any of his comments, just go to the letter to the Galatians, because apparently in Galata there was this issue, this specific issue of the conversion of Gentiles to Christianity. An interesting artifact from this time is actually, if you've been to Rome, in the church of Santa Sabina on the Aventine Hill, which is one of the ancient Roman basilicas. Basilica is from the 5th century, and so you could say it's kind of contemporary to St. John Chrysostom. At this basilica, in the very back where they would have the dedicatory plaques, so over the main entrance but the back of the church, opposite the altar, there are two enormous mosaics of two women. And the women, they look very stately Roman matrons, beautifully dressed, holding symbols, and both of them are personifications, which was very popular in classical Greece and in Rome. And so it's a personification, means taking something that is not a living person and making a person. So like when they say you'll see in some of the old icons of the baptism of Christ, you'll see a little man sitting in the River Jordan. And that's the personification of the Jordan. Or Bernini did the big fountain in Rome that has the personifications of the 4 great world rivers. And so these two figures at Santa Sabina have an inscription in Latin underneath them, and they date from around the year 500. So less than 100 years after John Chrysostom. And it says under one, it says, Ecclesia ex circuncisionis, which is church by circumcision, which means Jews who became Christian. And then the other one says, Ecclesia ex gentibus, church from the Gentiles, from those who are not Jewish. And so, and that was done to represent the two communities that came together to sponsor the building of this church. So this is, almost 500 years after Jesus, and there still was this tension about the relationship between Christianity and Judaism and how much Jewishness should be preserved within the Christian tradition. And so, John Chrysostom's 8 homilies against the Jews, 8 means it was apparently a big issue. These homilies were not meant to incite persecution, rioting against the Jews. These homilies were meant to address the issues within the Christian community between people whose ancestry was pagan and people whose ancestry was Jewish. Remember, Antioch is also a lot closer to Jerusalem and to the Holy Land than Constantinople and Rome. And so the presence of people who had been part of the migration out of the Holy Land when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, many of them would have settled in close by cities, and those are specifically the cities of Antioch, Beirut, Damascus. And so these homilies are not anti-Semitic. That's a kind of a footnote, but I did want to mention it because unfortunately he is one of the names that is thrown forward all the time when it comes to, the history of anti-Semitism amongst Christians. And this could not be further from the truth. But in this period of time, so he has these defense homilies, and then there is also there are festal homilies for the feasts of different of the church calendar, and then there are homilies which are panegyric. And the panegyric homilies are the ones composed for the feast days of churches, monasteries, chapels, and holy places. And so because it was meant to be a celebratory time. So St. John was also at this time, as a deacon, he was also responsible for the Church of Antioch's outreach to the poor and the less fortunate. And in his time, we know that, and under his leadership, the church on a daily basis in the city of Antioch alone fed over 3,000 people every single day. And these weren't necessarily homeless people. Remember that society at that time did not have any real built-in structures. There was no net to catch people who had fallen on hard times. The mortality rate was also very, a lot younger. People did not live as long as they do now. And very often a young family may suffer the loss of a parent or even both parents. And so a child then ends up orphaned. And sometimes, especially if the child comes from a poor family, extended family doesn't have the means to help them out. And so the poverty that you see has many different faces and realities, not the same as today's reality. However, John himself, he was very much concerned with the translation of that which is prayed and celebrated in the church, in the liturgy, and then translating that into practical terms. And I think that's one of the things where we have different fathers who are very lofty and very erudite about how they express the faith and the theology of the church. John is like that, but then he also challenges. He also then takes it up and makes it real. And I think one of the quotes that he's very famous for, and there are many, but they're all very challenging. He tells the people of Antioch, he tells them, how can you fast from food and drink and all different kinds of other sources of nutrition? How can you fast and be proud of that, and then go out and you eat up your neighbor? And he's talking specifically about gossip. And so that was, so he always had this way of translating. He says, like another saying that is, and I'm obviously not quoting it as it is word for word, but another saying was we turned into saying. Another point that he's quoted for, he said, you won't find Jesus in the chalice if you don't find him in the beggar at the door of the church. Those are things which you kind of think about, and it's really beautifully profound. And it also reveals that he's very sensitive to the people that he is working with, the people that he is serving. He knows what they are struggling with. And instead of, just taking it all monastic and getting very ethereal, he makes it very practical and very real. And so so he's quite a busy deacon. That's one of the realities. I'd like to say that he was already bishop for this, but he wasn't even a priest. And it's interesting because he held orders in such high regard, and in his writings you can see how much he struggles with his own worthiness to partake, within sacred orders. And we have, like one of the reasons, this is kind of funny, but one of the reasons that he did escape to the monastery was that he had gotten wind that some of the bishops of Antioch wanted to ordain him a deacon. And so he actually decided to escape. And then in his escaping, he set up one of his best friends who also was in the monastery with him, a guy named Basil, who is not Saint Basil, is a different person. But he set him up, and this guy ended up being then called to the diaconate. So there's a little bit of I guess you could say intrigue in avoiding ordaining bishops. And however, it didn't really pay off, because he did get eventually ordained both a deacon, and then 5 years later he was ordained a priest in the year 386. From that time, for 12 years, he dedicated himself and his ministry to preaching. And so the tradition in Antioch for him, the kind of the cycle that was set up, was he preached twice every week. Then in some seasons, especially like during Lent or around holy days, he would preach daily. And people came specifically to hear him preach. And they came because, and it's not that, I think if we would read his homilies, we may not be particularly inclined to say, well, this must have been an awesome homily, because we've changed. Society is different than it was at that time. But he had the ability to preach in a style that took into regard, the meter of the Greek language. And so it had a beat. He was not rapping, but as far as the poetic quality and how it rolled off his tongue and how he repeated words, and then the meter of like how many syllables each phrase had. He put a lot of work into creating these homilies that were, in a sense, they were musical and poetic, and then just very deep theologically and spiritually. And so during this period, he got a nickname which stuck. He got the nickname of Chrysostomos. And chryso is gold, and stomos is mouth. So the golden mouthed. So St. John Chrysostom is not his last name. Chrysostom is a nickname that he was given out of admiration for what he did so well. Now, this period of preaching, so what do we have left from all of this? We know that many of his sermons have not survived, both because they weren't written down, or they may not have been of the same caliber as the ones that were preserved, but he preached a lot. And we can tell by the body of work that has survived. And so surviving of Chrysostom's sermons are 1,447 sermons, which is a very large number for sermons to have survived some 1,600 years. Remember that most of that was handwriting. The sermons were printed and copied by monks who preserved them, and they chose. Ultimately, the monks were probably the ones who chose which ones were the best, and those then were put into manuscripts, and then that was copied again until the invention of the printing press. So that's quite a bit. And also, he was a prolific letter writer. Now, his letter writing comes primarily later in his life, and we'll get to that point. But the letters that we do have preserved, majority again are from that later period, number 240. And they're written for a specific reason, which we'll get into when we get to that point. So Chrysostom spends 12 years of preaching, and in the year 397, Patriarch Nectarios of Constantinople dies. And Constantinople has been having a little bit of a problem with the election of bishops and patriarchs. The church wants to elect its own, and the emperor wants to choose who he wants. So there's a little bit of a struggle there. But John is put forward as a candidate because he is very well known. His preaching, his teaching has gotten his name known, and he is also known as someone who is has a lot of self-control, and he truly does what he preaches. He truly lives what he preaches. And so that authenticity made him a candidate who would be appeal to both sides. And of course also to the emperor. He would be an outsider to the politics of Constantinople since he is from Antioch. And so he is elected as patriarch, and the emperor, who is Arcadius, so he approves the election. Some historians will say that he was the one who actually had initiated John as one of the candidates. There's a little bit of debate about, who did the deed here. But either way, he ended up getting elected. Now came the hardest part, getting John to accept his election as patriarch. Remember, he was a priest. He was not ordained a bishop. And if he was running from being ordained a deacon and then avoided being ordained a priest, then no way in HE double hockey sticks was he going to come to Constantinople to be the head of the second and most important see in all of Christianity. So what did they do? Well, they tricked him and they kidnapped him. And so he ended up being brought to Constantinople under false pretenses. And, once he was there, there was really nothing that he could do about it. So in the year 398, he was ordained and enthroned as Patriarch of Constantinople. And it seems that he did not lose any time in firing up his zeal and love for the church, and immediately began to preach and teach, became involved in evangelization, sending missionaries to different parts of the Byzantine Empire that had, for example, the Slavic peoples were just arriving in the Balkans in the 4th, 5th century. And so he sent missionaries to them to work among them. And he also instituted certain social structures that had worked in Antioch. And most importantly, a system of care for those who were dying, something that we would call hospice care. And also he insisted on literacy, education, but using, of course, the patristic tradition, the Gospels, as the starting point for this education. He also dedicated himself to the beauty of the worship of God. And so he composed a number of prayers for the liturgy, prayers which are still used in Byzantine churches, and a number of prayers that are also used in the Western Church, as well as he compiled the Divine Liturgy, the primary liturgy that is used in all Byzantine and Orthodox churches throughout the world. And so his liturgy isn't necessarily his composition. He took the traditions that were already pre-existing and he unified them, and then gave them a rendering in the Greek language, which was both poetic and spiritually charged. And so his translation, or not translation, his version, the liturgy that bears his name, is probably, I mean, it hasn't really changed that much as far as the language. And every time it is translated into another language, there is a concern to remain faithful to the beauty of the original Greek. He also compiled a number of prayers for the sacraments, and in the Byzantine churches, most importantly, for the sacrament of the anointing of the sick. And one can see that his concern for the sick with establishing a type of Byzantine hospice also was accompanied by spiritual care through the sacraments by composing these prayers for the anointing of the sick. Because he necessarily he saw the connectedness between what is preached and what is worshiped and what is the common everyday lived life experience. And now, so as he becomes very popular, obviously, because he's in touch with the people. And even though now, by this time, John has been dealing with health problems. So when you see, for example, looking at the icon, the way that his icon is preserved, you'll notice the cheeks have those very pronounced lines, and the forehead also. And those cheeks are kind of like, they're supposed to be like sunken cheeks, because he had so many problems with different foods and after his monastic experience, that physically he bore the marks of his physical difficulties. And so he was unable to really eat anything well. He would eat very minimally because he would be always in distress. And so, and how do we know this? Well, we know this because unlike other Byzantine patriarchs and other bishops even, he avoided dinner engagements. So he got invitations to go out for dinner, to go to people's homes. Anywhere where there was a meal involved, he always had an excuse. And of course, he blamed it on his monastic style of living and simplicity, but we know better. It was really about the difficulties that he had with just with digestion and with normal foods. So that was something that was going to afflict him for the rest of his life. Now, so you would think, well, he's having a rather good time as Patriarch of Constantinople. He is well regarded. The churches are jammed. People are coming to hear him preach and teach. And he has the respect of many people there too. Well, the problem is he didn't have the respect of everyone. One of the things that most bothered John was the lifestyles of the rich and powerful. And coming from Antioch, Antioch was, it had its rich, but it didn't have like the court of the emperor. And so it was a different type of society. Constantinople was the last of the ancient Roman cities. It had a lot of, intrigue. It had a lot of drama. It had many noble families that could trace their lineage all the way back to the founding of the city of Rome. Families that were active in politics. And of course, the presence of the emperor was one of the big issues, that although the emperor helped the church, he also tried to control the church. Although the emperor would sponsor different ecclesiastical events, like throwing an ecumenical council, ultimately the church seemed to be beholden to him. And of course, he wanted to use the church also for his own political adventures. And so John begins this kind of a series of homilies that talk about the excesses and the frivolities of certain people. And I think his main I guess the fire, or the match that kind of lit the fire, was when the Empress Eudokia, she was an interesting woman who enjoyed the good life and loved being the center of attention and setting fashion trends. And she was very Beverly Hills for the year 400. And she had been hurt by someone in the court, and this dignitary had passed away, and he had passed away dishonorably. So he had been disgraced. And however, she was so hell-bent on vengeance that she started a process of appropriating all of the property and monies, goods that had been left behind to the widow and the children of this disgraced dignitary. And, and for them, they had lost a husband and a father, but she didn't care. She was going to drive the widow and the kids to poverty. And in this fit of bitterness, John Chrysostom gets wind of this court scandal. And so what does he do? He preaches about it. And he expresses support for the widow and the kids. And then it's a series of homilies, it's not like a political homily per se. He conceals it or kind of camouflages it enough so that it actually is for people who do not know what's going on. It's actually a regular homily about the excesses of, rich Constantinopolitan living. But the people from the court who are sitting in church and are hearing this, they're like, gee, that vile, vain woman, which is the term he used, sounds a lot like our empress. And so they took that back to her. And she became enraged. She just became furious. And so she connects with, because, this is the way it was done, she connects with bishops who don't like him, because equally he's also, he criticizes the bishops under him, who have, like, for example, there were a number of bishops who had bought their way into the episcopacy, and so he has them deposed. He has bishops who are political. He has them punished also. So either they get out of politics and just do church, or they suffer the consequences. And, so all of these intrigues are there. Well, Eudokia uses these bishops who feel that they have been, unjustly accused and removed from power. She uses them as a way of getting rid of John. And so they decide to overthrow him. And they try him. And it's because, and then the accusation is that he is spreading lies about the empress. He is maligning her character. And so these complaints come to court, and not an ecclesiastical court, because at this time it's all kind of one big old mess. Government and ecclesiastical were kind of overlapping. And the judges find him guilty, and they ask for him to be executed. That's how bad it was. And obviously Eudokia was behind this, and she wanted to send a message also to whoever would be the successor, not to mess with her. And so the emperor, though, Arcadius, he decides to exile John Chrysostom, and so he vacates that the execution verdict. And so as John is leaving the city, so he's all set, ready to be sent into exile, a huge earthquake happens, and Eudokia gets all freaked out, as does the rest of the court. And so they ask him to come back. And so he comes back and is once again reinstated. So it's kind of an interesting story. However, that's not the end. So as he returns back to Constantinople, the situation there is tense. The bishops who were part of this overthrowing, including one of the bishops involved was actually the Patriarch of Alexandria, who was trying to get his own candidate in as Patriarch of Constantinople, so that he could reap some of the financial benefits of the royal household. And since Alexandria didn't have anything either, he ends up, you've got all these bishops who are now convicted by their own actions. And they're worried about what John is going to do to them, if there are going to be any ramifications. And so Nothing really happens of that, because John, if anything, is tells us about the character of John. It's that he is not vindictive. He speaks like this whole episode with Eudokia was not about vindication. It was not about using the pulpit as a bully pulpit, but it was about truth. It was about justice. It was about Christian values. And so his approach would really not have been all that consequential for any of those bishops who had gone against him. Obviously, they weren't going to get into his good graces, but he would not be seeking retribution. And so, unfortunately, things continued to escalate. Although Eudokia had tried to reconcile and get into his good graces, it was really not happening. And so once again, the political intrigues turn on John, and he is convicted by an ecclesiastical pseudo-council. So the bishops decided, well, if we can't do it through the government, then with the sponsorship of Eudokia and Arcadius, the emperor was okay. He was okay with this, and I guess he felt that John did kind of overstep his criticism of Eudokia. They called a local council of the church and deposed John Chrysostom, and then once again sent him into exile. And the main thing this time was, and it's interesting, so it doesn't really show up in the council things, but John was very critical of a new statue that Eudokia had put up of herself in front of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. And since it was, and what's in a statue? Well, putting it in front of the church of herself, it was probably meant to provoke, to remind John Chrysostom who's really in charge. And then she also sponsored a lot of activities around the statue, from an open market to music and concerts and parties and lots of wine and the way Greeks celebrate. And these events were going on while services were happening in the cathedral. And so the noise of music and revelry would get into Hagia Sophia, and you could hear it because the Hagia Sophia is acoustically quite perfect. And this is not the one that's there now. This is a smaller version, but the sound was still perfect. And so it would get inside with every time somebody walked into the church, and you could hear the revelry. And so John criticized that as being inappropriate, and that Eudokia took it as a personal attack again. And so they drew up this council to have him thrown out. And just to make it really real, they seized John Chrysostom at the Divine Liturgy on Holy Saturday and removed him. So it was meant as a very strong affront to the church. And so they removed him and held him under house arrest. Pope Innocent from Rome tried, appealed to the emperor in Constantinople that they should not be doing this. And so John was then shortly after Pentecost, so from Easter to Pentecost, talking about 50 days or so, he was packed up and sent to Armenia in exile. An area, and this is not the good part of Armenia, this is the isolated part of Armenia, in the mountains where it's wet and humid and rainy and icy and snowy. And he was sent there on purpose because they knew the situation with his health and that kind of weather would wreak havoc with him, which it did. And so his time spent there in Armenia was of major letter writing. So this is where the letters come in that we have. Now he definitely wrote many letters earlier in his life. This was something that was very common among people at that time, people who could read and write. And so, but the letters that he wrote before then, we don't have much that survives from that period, because they would have been more, I would say, common letters, of support and friendship to other bishops and patriarchs. For example, he wrote, exchanged letters with Saint Maron, who is considered the founder of the Maronite Church. And so his letters, though, at this point in exile, take on a different meaning. They're letters that talk about his situation, his health, try to build up the churches that are unhappy and desperate at seeing this kind of a thing happen in the church. And so he writes letters of encouragement. He writes letters as a father does to his children, to his family. And so the letters are preserved, many are preserved because of that, because of what he was going through and what they talk about. So unfortunately, though, the royal court has, perhaps they thought he would die sooner, but since he was still alive, they ordered him to go to another area, and that is from Armenia towards the Black Sea in a region called Abkhazia, that is by Georgia, former Soviet Union. And it is an area that's even more unfriendly to living. And so as he was traveling there under military escort, in the most inhuman conditions, really, you could make a case for this being a martyrdom. They stopped on his way there. They stopped at the church of Saint Basiliscus. And Basiliscus was an early Christian martyr. And there they stopped to pray and rest before continuing on. And the weather was cold and rainy. It was late summer, but you're in the mountains, so it's not really warm. And in the cold rain and icy conditions, his health had deteriorated. And so they stopped at this chapel to spend the night, to pray. And when he was there that evening, so he had a vision of Saint Basiliscus, who told him, "Do not despair, Brother John. Tomorrow we shall be together." And he received, with him were traveling, of course, also some of his own confidants, priests. And so he received communion and the anointing of the sick, and he died on September 14th in the year 407. And his last words, which are recorded and have been repeated and repeated, his last words were, "Glory to God for all things." And unfortunately, after he died, so his body was buried there locally and was not brought back to Constantinople. After he had been taken from Constantinople, unfortunately, the supporters of St. John fought with the supporters of the emperor, and in that the original church of Hagia Sophia, the first one, was burnt to the ground, and a number of other significant buildings were damaged. And so it took a few years for his body to be brought back to Constantinople. And so it was, they were transferred to Constantinople in the year 438. So it took, approximately 21 years for things to change. The interesting things as far as what happened, well, the year that that he had been exiled and sent away. So after his exile, well, so Pentecost was like June. In October, the Empress Eudokia dies. And there's like another earthquake, and it's it was the Byzantines 2020. And so they had a bad year, and they took it as a sign of God's displeasure. But control being control, and politicians being politicians, even those things didn't faze the emperor, who still tried to maintain absolute control over everything, and unfortunately was unable to. And so, it's a rather sad ending. But when his body was brought back to the city, the feast was instituted. I believe it is the 27th of January, which is when his body was brought back, and it became one of the great feasts of the Eastern Church. Yes, 27th of January, the memory of the translation of the relics of our Holy Father, John Chrysostom. And so he has a number of feasts when he is remembered. But, as far as his life is very fascinating because of how real he is. There isn't a disconnect between what his faith is and what he feels compelled to do because of faith. It's very much connected. He, like every human being, so he does, of course, try to get away from some of God's plans. So, such as ordination was not one of his priorities. And, but God has another plan. And so that's what we see developing and happening. And then, of course, he acquiesces, he accepts it, which is, beautiful in and of itself. Now, so the relics are brought back to Constantinople. They are enshrined in the Church of the Holy Apostles. Hagia Sophia would not be rebuilt for another 100 years. And so in the 520s under Justinian, the Hagia Sophia, which we see today, was built. And so the Church of the Holy Apostles took over as being the most important church in the city. And so it was natural for him to be buried there. However, his relics were not done with their travels. And in the Fourth Crusade, in 1204, his body was removed from the city and from the Church of the Holy Apostles, and the body was taken to Venice. Venice had the body there for a number of years, and then it was brought to the city of Rome and enshrined in Old St. Peter's. So not the current Michelangelo Basilica, but the original basilica built by Constantine. And then it remained there until Pope John Paul II on November 27th gave the relics back to the Patriarchate, and they were brought to the Patriarchal Cathedral of St. George in Istanbul, formerly Constantinople. Another interesting tidbit of information is the mother of St. John Chrysostom. Her name is Anthusa. So she was also canonized. And so St. Anthusa celebrates her feast day on the same day as John Chrysostom, which in the Byzantine and Orthodox churches is November 13th. Usually the feast day of the saint is celebrated on the day of death, which used to be called in the church, it was called Dies Natalis, so day of birth into eternal life. And so, however, John died on September 14th, which is the feast day of the elevation of the Holy Cross. And so his feast was moved to November so that he would be celebrated separately. There were a number of, since it was already an established holy day, that took precedence over his feast day. There is also, just as a little bit of a follow-up footnote, the church also celebrates the feast of the three holy hierarchs, which are these three guys. And this is St. Basil the Great, St. John Chrysostom, and St. Gregory the Theologian, who was also Patriarch of Constantinople. So this is one of the feast days associated with John Chrysostom, and yet the three of these were not really connected. So it's their bishops, but they live in different times, they have different experiences, and so they weren't necessarily what we would say contemporary. However, the reasoning, this is where, just so you know where this feast comes from. Apparently, in the 12th century, under the reign of Emperor Alexius in Constantinople, the three bishops, Basil the Great, Gregory the Theologian, John Chrysostom, were all being brought as examples of what a great bishop is. And the people of the city were picking who they wanted as this great ideal bishop. And it was creating a lot of problems even in the churches, because all of a sudden you had the people who were fond of Basil, and so they knew Basil's writings and quoted him, And then they weren't nice to the people who were Chrysostom supporters, and it's like Byzantine high school popularity contest. It was just people were mean to each other. It was dividing the church for no apparent reason, and so one of the as the church was trying to address this, you even had bishops who were involved in this. And so one of the bishops who was very well respected amongst the clergy of Constantinople, name is John Mauropus. He was the Metropolitan of Uchaita in Asia Minor. And he had a vision. And he said he related the vision to the other bishops in the Holy Synod. And he said to them that he saw the three together. And at first they all spoke distinctly and separately. And then as he listened, he realized that they were all speaking with one voice, that there was no distinction between the three. And the words that he wrote down, he recorded in this vision, they told him, "As you see, the three of us are with God, and no discord or rivalry divides us. Each of us according to the circumstances and according to the inspiration that he received from the Holy Spirit, wrote and taught what befits the salvation of mankind. There is not among us a first, a second, or a third. And if you invoke one of us, the other two are immediately present with him. Therefore, tell those who are quarreling not to create divisions in the church because of us. For when we were on earth, we spared no effort to reestablish unity and concord in the world. You can conjoin our three commemorations in one feast day and compose a service for it, inserting the hymns dedicated to each of us according to the skill and knowledge that God has given you. Then transmit it to the Christians with the command to celebrate it each year. If they honor us thus as being with and in God, we give them our word that we will intercede for their salvation in our common prayer." And so that vision clarified what was a popularity contest. And those religious popularity contests can be really the worst sometimes. But so this feast, if you ever wondered why we celebrate it, it actually comes out of that. And so it doesn't have a genesis that is more intimately connected to the lives of these saints. I do have some pictures I want to share with you all so that you can see a little bit into these. And some of these paintings are beautiful masterpieces from the 19th century, realism. This is John Chrysostom preaching in front of Eudokia, who is standing there on in the balcony in the place reserved for the royal family. And John is wearing white because that is the other thing. When he was dying, he requested that his priests, his friends who were companions, who were traveling with him, that they help him change into white clothing, into the baptismal garment. And so not literally his baptismal garment, but white clothing symbolically reminding of baptism. And so in these paintings, because his life was remarkable in so many ways, so they have him dressed in white. Then, and here is another image, also from the same period, showing John again dressed in white, accusing Eudokia of all of her affluence. And then this image here, this image is in Hagia Sophia. It is under the dome, and it is an icon done in mosaics in the 10th century of John Chrysostom. Of course, by that time, John was the epitome of Byzantine fathers, Byzantine spirituality, and of course, the divine liturgy that was celebrated every day in that church bore his name. And so this mosaic is still beautiful. Unfortunately, this is one of the mosaics that's affected now that the Turks have turned Hagia Sophia into a mosque. So these are covered up now during prayers and then open for tourists between prayer times. And then in the city of Rome, well, John Chrysostom was very important for Rome also. That's one of the reasons why his body was brought from Venice, still, at the end of the Middle Ages, was brought down to Rome and enshrined in Old St. Peter's, because he was one of the most important church fathers. And of course, he was also defended by the Pope when he was sent unjustly into exile. And so this sculpture that is behind the main altar, you have the papal altar with the baldacchino. That is not the main altar of the church. This is actually the main altar. And it is the altar of the chair of St. Peter. There are inside the sculpture created by Bernini, there are supposed to be pieces, relics of a chair that St. Peter sat on when he was in Rome. And so in this group, there is also St. John Chrysostom, and he is, I believe he is the one here without the mitre, so the one in the back. So, and this was, now St. John's relics weren't here at this altar. He was given a specific side altar where his relics were held. And you can go in the basilica, and that altar is still there. And there are a small portion of relics of bones from his body that have been left there. Not everything was sent to back to Constantinople. So, but it was a very small portion of, most of it was sent back to Constantinople. And then in Constantinople itself, right now, the way that it is set up, in the Patriarchal Basilica of St. George, both of these caskets, which are carved from alabaster, and inside have a clear glass or crystal box, and in the box are all the bones of, on the right hand side we have St. John Chrysostom, and on the left hand St. Gregory the theologian, both who were patriarchs of Constantinople. And so both of their relics were in the Vatican, and both were returned at the same time in 2004. And the way that it is, I don't have a good picture of the way that it is laid out, but the bones were taken by the Augustinian nuns who are close to the Vatican, and they are the nuns who take care of making all of the reliquaries of the different saints. And so they took the bones and they prepared them, and with gold thread, they sewed them to a piece of cloth that is at the bottom of the box. And so you have the bones laid out in not necessarily in a natural form of a human being, but they're all laid out and individually marked and individually stitched into place. And so it's beautiful reliquary and quite moving to see. And then this is the last picture that I have here. Here you get a little bit of a close-up of the icon, and you can see into the casket in the back, the alabaster casket. You can see a red ribbon, and the red ribbon, which goes completely around the box, has been sealed with the Pope's seal. I think it's from his ring. And so it has the wax seal, and you can see a little bit of the bones there, like through that beehive pattern. But so this is where the relics have been placed on the left-hand side of the patriarchal cathedral of St. George. And unfortunately, it's not the Church of the Holy Apostles. That church is pretty much destroyed. The Ottoman Empire took the patriarchate and moved it every couple of years. And so the patriarch would be uprooted and moved to another church. And Constantinople had many churches, of course, but the Ottomans converted most of the churches into mosques. And then the most important thing, they wanted to make sure that the patriarchate would be centered, or the patriarchal cathedral would be a church that was built under the Ottoman Empire. So St. George is a later church built in I believe in this early 1700s, and it is not a Byzantine church. By that time, by the time of the moving to St. George's, the patriarchate no longer had in the city or in the immediate area around the city any church that predated the fall of Constantinople in 1453. So it's a kind of a psychological way of affecting the church there, giving them a feeling of nothingness. And yet today when you go there, it's beautiful because the church has brought together different relics that were saved from churches. There's the miraculous icon of the Virgin Pamakaristos, which is from the 12th century, was removed from one of the Byzantine churches. There is also a piece of the column from the flagellation of Christ. There was a relic that was in the Patriarchate in the 9th century. And so these pieces had been somehow saved. They were taken out of the churches, probably taken by priests and hidden until they could be brought back. And today that cathedral, even though it's not an original Byzantine era cathedral, it is filled with the history of the Christian Byzantine Empire in Constantinople. So I also, if you would like to read more about St. John, which I do encourage you to, many of his homilies and letters are available online in a variety of English translations. And some of the translations are very poetic because they were composed, in Victorian era, and they become difficult to read. However, there are also many modern translations available. Many are offered through Amazon and through St. Vladimir Seminary Press in Crestwood, New York. Then probably the best book about St. John is actually this one called Golden Mouth, the story of St. John Chrysostom. This is by J.N.D. Kelly. And this reads beautifully because it is very much about the person of John, and not just his writings, not just focused on his vast body of accomplishments, but you get to know who he is. You get to know a little bit about his mindset, because I think John, although he may be intimidating for some, because of, I think, the level of his lived faith and asceticism, he comes across as being rigid sometimes. And I would say that that's not true. He's rigid with himself, and he tries to hold the Christian community and trust it to him to a higher standard. And so I don't think it's he's not unapproachable. I think he could actually be as approachable as someone like Saint Nicholas. He was truly a shepherd of his sheep. He was truly a good bishop. He was not afraid of criticism, not afraid of the powers that be. And, and that really renders him, especially for the church today, a model of what a good shepherd is. And his teachings still teach. His life example is still relevant. And I love the fact that those beautiful words, glory to God for all things. I mean, it's a beautiful prayer. It is a beautiful sentiment. It is something, to repeat many times through the day, especially when we go through difficult times, especially when dealing with pandemic or, all the anxiety. So it's good to just stop and say that, glory to God for all things. So any questions?
I had a question about the issue you brought up about the Judaism in the liturgy and all this kind of stuff. So when the canon of the New Testament wasn't accepted until 350, 300, something like that. So the original liturgy would have had Old Testament readings in it, but it probably wouldn't have had gospel readings in it necessarily, or was that already introduced before the canon was accepted?
No, the gospel tradition was already there. It's just the final approbation. The way that, for example, the way that we know the gospels in book form was actually an invention of Constantine. It was any of the scriptures that we have from the New Testament preserved prior to that come in papyrus form. So but you had the readings we know which gospels and epistles were being used, and then there are some alternates that may have been used, which we don't know. Because I don't think they would have used gospels that weren't specifically about the life of Christ. And the gospels that were heretical, they were being used by heretical groups, whether it be Arians or Gnostics who really weren't Christian, but they would be using their own texts. So the ones that would be preserved within Christian communities of Rome and Philippi and Alexandria and the Holy Land, those would be the earlier versions of what Constantine then brought together in one book form and what became canonical. The Jewish scriptures was already canonically approved because it was brought over from the Jewish use in Alexandria prior to the birth of Christ.
Well, so I guess the other part of that question is, like in the Latin Rite, they every Sunday they have an Old Testament reading. I don't mean psalm or whatever. I mean an actual reading. And apparently that's a recent development since Vatican II. They used to be just like the Eastern Rite, that they didn't have a You just have the epistle and the gospel. You don't have an Old Testament reading, and that's the way it used to be in the Latin Rite. But so my question is, what was that something that was pushed out and brought back in, or that was never in it, or how did that work out?
Well, I think each ritual church, each rite has its own tradition on how things happen. So, for example, in the Byzantine churches, the use of Old Testament readings is specifically tied to Vespers. So it is the evening prayer before the feast. And there are other places too, other hours where it appears. In some places, there is a tradition of Old Testament readings, but I think things that were done 1,500 years ago, after different historic events like the iconoclasm, things changed, and the influence of monasticism became strong in liturgy. So each rite has kind of its own history. There are many who would like to see more Old Testament in the Divine Liturgy, and and I think it's not a bad idea, because if we're going to understand the hope of the coming of the Messiah, you have to have that context. You can't just kind of jump into the story midway. You have to understand also what's going on in the Old Testament and what God has been doing among his people.
Do you know if John was sick as a young man before he went into the monastic life?
It doesn't seem that there is a history of illness prior to monasticism. And he was known, to be very strict and strictest with himself. And I think at that age, remember, he was in his early 20s. There is a certain zealous attitude, of embracing Christianity. He was baptized when he was 18. So all of this was happening in a relatively small time span. And so the zeal of being a new Christian, and then discovering monasticism, and he called monasticism the Christian philosophy. And so he saw it as the antidote to pagan philosophy. And so it's not a surprise that he took it on a little bit too much, and unfortunately that became then the cross he had to bear for the rest of his life.
Since St. John Chrysostom was popular, were there any reaction on his exile by the people of Constantinople?
Well, there were both times. The first time that he was exiled, and that he didn't get too far. After the natural disasters, the people took it as a sign, and they were protesting in the streets. And he had a lot of supporters among the common folk, people who heard him preach every day, much more than the affluent types and the emperor. And then, of course, with the second time he was exiled, where he actually never made it back to Constantinople, so there the protests became so violent that they burnt down the cathedral. The old Hagia Sophia was burnt down, and then who burnt it down? It's not that his followers went and burnt it down. It's in all of the protesting and the disaster that protests can become, that the collateral damage ended up being that, as well as the senatorial palace that was also significantly damaged, and a lot of other parts of the city suffered too. So there was a big reaction to it. And then the city was also attacked, and that same year, and the Empress Eudokia was died in October. And it was funny because even the enemies of the Byzantines said that that they were being punished for something that they had done.
Thank you, Father.
You're welcome. Okay, well, have a good week.